you'd asked me to repeat something I had said in conversation about this whole unity thing, and the whole question, this whole place is strewn with my 4x6 cards in some disarray all over the place. Yes, I'm doing Kabbalah, pronounce it as you will, and the question that appeals to me and occurs to me as a philosopher, which is what I am by training, philosophy professor, is whether or not it's possible to reduce Kabbalah to a very simple number of axioms. That was my first point. Are there just several independent but very simple propositions that underlie the entire conception and drive the whole thing? Or, better yet, and of course this is the ultimate dream of all systems, a single underlying, call it a principle, logos, underlying logic, in that very rich Greek word logos, which means, it's the word in Greek that means word, but for close to 3,000 years has been used in a much richer sense. It appears in the New Testament very importantly, also, of course, in the Gospel of John, as we've talked about so often, and recurs in our area too. Hegel, and I make a lot of the connection between Hegel and Kabbalah. Hegel, to me, is the philosophical realization of most of the important Kabbalistic ideas, and in fact it has been shown by scholars that Hegel was, in fact, directly and indirectly, but mostly indirectly, consciously affected by Kabbalah. He knew something about it, and he incorporated some of its ideas, although he was working on some of those ideas himself.
Well,
all right, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that intrigues me here is that you're in your reduction. This is very similar to what goes on in science as you try and drill down and look at things in a reductionist fashion. But the question then comes into being, do you lose something by reducing something to its essence? And I'll give an example that I think everyone can grab a hold of here. Let's take the written language. It's made up, if you reduce it down to its basic core, it's letters in an alphabet. The individual letters have very little meaning on their own. The letter A, other than being an article, it carries very little meaning. You put these letters and group them into a word, now they carry some degree of meaning. You put the words into a sentence, it carries even more meaning. Put the sentences into a paragraph, now the richness of the meaning increases to where we get to a whole book, and you can have a very rich source of meaning. Kabbalah being a spiritualized internal process, do we actually destroy part of the richness of its meaning by bringing it down to its actual basics?
This is where it gets really wonderful as far as I'm concerned, because there is no conflict here. We embrace both sides of this. The quest for the underlying unity is at the same time something which shows us the richness and the complexity that you're talking about. Because it turns out that the unity has to do with the expansion of complexity. That's what the unity is all about. Let's talk about it for a second. Instead of saying the it, is there something here I mean, is there a sacred heart, an inner sanctum of Kabbalistic insight? Is there some way that we could begin to discuss the very nature of this unifying conception?
Okay.
Okay? Well, isn't that lucky? I have it written down somewhere, right here. Be fruitful and multiply is basically it. That is to say, it's a very, very rich command. Be fruitful and multiply. It's a command to be incessantly creative.
So you're taking it as more than just the literal talking about reproduction.
Oh, yeah. Of course, I'm using the biblical text as if
you're going metaphorical.
Yeah,
okay.
If you want me, I'd like to take for my Sunday sermon. I'd like to take a little bit of text. I'll take old Noah and be fruitful and multiply. But I want to make a much bigger sermon on the basis. Yes, I don't mean that the quotation from the Hebrew Bible, which was focused mostly on literal, sexual reproduction. But you know what? When you think about it, you got to wonder about that too. I mean, isn't there something richer about God saying to them, be fruitful and multiply, than mere biological reproduction? You should live and be well, we Jews sometimes say to each other. You should live and be well. There's an element of that too.
We can go Star Trek and Vulcan by going live long and prosper as well. Yeah.
Right. But no, what I want to call attention to, though, is that there's something inherently expansive and developmental about the whole thing. Something explosive about the whole thing. The whole story of what spirit is becomes the story of incessant human creativity. Very Promethean in its way. There are lots of resonances. I want to make this feel and sound very materialistic. It's not a materialism because it's all about spirit. And yet, this is crucial to the whole thing. Spirit is always spirit materialized. Spirit exists in us. It couldn't be if it were not actually expressed in the human organism. One that ought to lose 25 pounds or so, but so embodiment, actual embodiment of human intelligence, not just in ourselves as bodies, of course, but in the material culture that we build, our cities, all of our devices, which make us what we are. We wouldn't know anything about the universe. Imagine what the senses would be if we lacked the telescopes that told us about things far away, the microscopes that told us about things close in. Lenses in general are just one, but think of all the things we have made, the culture we have built up. There's an incessant, feverish, Faustian, because the German writer Goethe, of course, goes into this temperament. The idea is of be fruitful and multiply. The word I want to look at is multiply.
Well, from what?
Don't maintain status quo. It's not a question of maintain. The whole nature of the game is to take what's there and move it to the next higher stage.
And in doing that, you're reminding me, I'm constantly making these comparisons between what you're talking about in the spiritual, which I think I could kind of sum up with, you're talking about a ground of all being somewhere, and then there's a coming into being that takes that and makes it more complex. So what you're talking about is creativity.
And each one of us, if your point about generalizations is absolutely right, of course. One has to understand the function of a unifying generalization. It can't provide you with the guidance about how to deal with the concrete circumstances you're in. What it can do is get your eye on the ball in terms of concentrating on the categories of existence which are relevant. In real life situations, how do you solve problems? How do you move the situation to one level of organization with its problems, with its disorganization, with its, in other words, with its contradictions, as a Hegelian might put it?
So I'm getting the feeling as I try and do this comparison in my head, you're getting into complexity theory, and in the sense that you're talking about things that start off. A good example of this in why, even in science, reducing things down to their basics might be helpful from an accounting point of view. But given all the laws of physics, we can't anticipate chemistry. Given all the laws of chemistry, we can't anticipate biology.
Exactly.
There's a complexity in this and an emergence that I think this pregnancy with becoming and creativity is taking these basic things that we can put into a nice accounting ledger and say, okay, we know this, 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 and this. Yet there's something else mysterious going on here, that when these things combine in the way the world works, we wind up with the laws of physics giving us chemistry, chemistry giving us biology. And while we can drill down within those individual disciplines, there's a lack of predictability in terms of the creativity involved once you get to complex systems, and especially complex systems building on other complex systems.
And here's where the word creativity comes in. I start off with that word. And remember, that's the same word as creation, you know.
Mm-hmm.
We get into the question of the creation of the universe. But it's pretty good if you start off with the notion that creativity, not just intelligence, but intelligence, yes, mind, yes, spirit, yes, all these are various terms that we use for different aspects of this. But the term I want to use for the moment, creativity, suggests itself precisely for the reasons that you've said. Yes, multiply. Again, that means, it's something very interesting from a scientific point of view involved here. It means, don't think in conservationist terms. As scientists, we think of the conservation of matter or energy, or now matter/energy in advanced physics. But the notion that there is a fundamental quantum of stuff which is conserved, maintained, is a pretty deep principle of science. Here, with all respect for that, I'm not challenging the appropriateness of that in science as it occurs. But here there's a different rule. And it's important to see the power of it. I mean, to be in awe of it. Going back to your point about leaps, you mentioned quite right, from the physical to the chemical, from the chemical to the biological. Each one of these, you used quite rightly the word emergence, one of my favorite words, to mark the fact that it's not just a development, which you might think of as a smooth, basically gradualist thing, but, and I would say all the time, sometimes quite dramatically, as with the formation of life on this planet, what a quantum jump it was the moment that life, and we're not just talking about chemistry into biology, we're talking about chemicals, real chemicals on the face of the planet, somehow in some tidal pool or wherever they conjecture it was, making the leap into a living microorganism of some kind. That's an astonishing leap. But not just at those astonishing moments, although those are the great ones, those are the ones you're going to hold up as exemplars of what you're talking about. Nonetheless, really all the time, what spirit is something driven by the imperative, create. make something new that's never been there before by taking what is here now and giving it a twist it's never been twisted before. Yes, you stick with the old materialist notion, that's the materialist dimension, that you can't make anything without transforming the materials at hand. We can't make the next world without actually transforming this very world. And this is where, when I get into the New Testament and say, this is what the New Testament is talking about too, it's the transformation of this very world into the kingdom of God.
Well, you made a very interesting point that I want to build on here, because you mentioned the conservation laws.
Yes.
And people tend to mix and match things that aren't supposed to be mixed and matched. The conservation laws only apply to a closed system.
Mm-hmm.
Now the debate rages, what is a closed system and what systems are closed? There's a scientific assumption that the universe is a closed system. We have no hope of proving that. We have no data for it, other than it makes us feel good to think that the universe is all there is and it's closed. Let me bring it down a little bit more locally. Everything you're describing as creativity comes from a non-closed system driven from equilibrium. In an equilibrium, nothing happens. Things just sit there. You don't get life in a system at equilibrium. A human being is the ultimate system that is very far from equilibrium in terms of a physics equilibrium. We may be well balanced in terms of our energy levels, but even if you consider the Earth is not a closed system. It's everything, all the creativity of biology and chemistry is either, some of it is driven internally by core heat in the center of the Earth, but if you consider the Earth, everything is driven by sunlight. So that means we now must include the sun into our system. So a lot depends here on definitions. But certainly, if we want to envision the heart of creativity, we have to look at non-equilibrium and things being driven away from nice and stable.
And that's being driven itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those two words are enough. From something to something else. Always from something to something else. This aspect, you can also, the character Faust as a dramatic portrayal comes to mind in this context, of course, because another way of painting the picture, and this is what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to paint the picture in various ways. Talking about it, trying to tease out of it all of the complexity that really is there,